to the S4 main stage, Dale Peterson of Digital Bond.
So the title of my talk is The Simple Solution to Securing ICS in an IoT World. And I was tempted to just say, don't connect them and drop the mic and walk off stage, because that, but I had to fill some time. So no, that would be fighting the future. We know that our ICS, at least some of them are, and I would argue most of them, will be connected to external devices, to cloud services and other things. And how are we going to do that? And how are we going to get in front of this challenge? I think one of the problems we have, and we need to get our heads around, is the terminology, because terminology can be helpful and unhelpful. A real good example of this is Joe Weiss, who I like to call the Paul Revere of our ICS security community, because last decade he was a guy, we have a problem. He did tremendous work on awareness, but he likes to point to the NIST definition of a cyber incident that says not only is a cyber incident when someone attacks your system or you get malware on your system, but if, for example, you reprogrammed your PLC database and didn't scan it and it caused a problem, or you misconfigured a switch, it's a cyber incident. Anything that is happening over a communication channel on an ICS that causes a problem fits in this cyber incident category. And in a sense, he's right. I don't disagree with that. But then when we make that term that global and that encompassing, it tends to be less useful to us. And what you really need underneath that is a taxonomy of types of cyber incidents so we can begin to decide how to protect against them. And I think the same thing has happened to us with the industrial Internet of Things, or whatever you want to call it, industrial Internet, Industry 4.0. We have basically included anything that could possibly do monitoring and control in this definition. I was at the ARC event in Orlando, I guess it was about 3 years ago, when they first began using this term, and I'd go to a talk from an asset owner who had a very traditional SCADA system that had been deployed 8 years ago, and they were calling it IIoT. And what is your IIoT strategy? And every DCS was that. And eventually I talked to Sid, who does some of the cybersecurity work for ARC, and I asked him flat out, I said, are you saying that IIoT is everything that we called ICS plus everything new? And the answer was yes. So it has this same problem where it is just all-encompassing. And so if we ask the question, how are we going to secure IIoT or industrial internet, it's very difficult to come up with a useful answer. And I'd even take it a step further. I'd say when we look at how are we going to secure our ICS, we have a tendency to look at them too monolithically. So for example, everyone tends to jump to the most dramatic case, the nuclear power plant, or something that if it's out for a minute could cost tremendous amount of money, great inconvenience, affect the economy or the environment. We tend to jump to this. And certainly it's important that we secure the nuclear power plant, but the way we secure that nuclear power plant is probably very different than the way we secure a chewing gum factory. A factory like this maybe runs 2 8-hour shifts Monday through Friday and one shift on Saturday. And if they're down for 7 days, it's not that big of a deal. Now, they're not going to be happy about it, but they just run 3 shifts till they catch up and they produce their product. So securing this is going to be very different than securing a nuclear power plant. And then if we look even at a different, dimension, think about all the small ICS we have. This is a small municipal water system. And in this example, they have 2 people in their IT department. And those 2 people are responsible for the email server, the printers, the VP's laptop that's constantly breaking, and the SCADA system. Okay, so they have really no chance of doing a good job with their ICS security policy. So we have a lot of different conditions. But for this talk today, I want to use the term that most of us have lived with for the last 3 to 5 years, ICS, to mean traditional DCS, SCADA, PLC-based control, and tackle what is a simple solution for connecting these ICS to external devices, and the example I'm going to use most is the cloud. So how do we take advantage of these services while still protecting our ICS? Before I mentioned when we talk about ICS, we tend to jump to the worst, most dramatic conclusion like a nuclear power plant. When we talk about things like cloud services, we tend to jump to the easiest one to secure. And the one you hear most often is this idea of predictive maintenance or efficiency studies. So the idea is you have your ICS, it's creating all this data, you send it out to this third-party vendor, probably your ICS vendor or somebody who knows the industry. They crunch the data and they say, oh, you were supposed to do this maintenance at 6 months, but it's been dirtier, you need to do it at 3 months to prevent downtime. Or if you change this setting, you will generate more power. And this is really a tremendous service. This is something that asset owners like because it allows them to have less downtime and more efficiency. And of course, the vendors like it because they can make money from this service. And this is a real easy one to secure. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. If you need the data out in the cloud or wherever you want to send it, you can just send it through a Oneway device, and that way they have the data, they can offer the service, but you don't put the availability or integrity of your ICS at risk. So this one is really simple, and a lot of times people jump to this. But what we're finding, and these are anonymized conversations that we've had over the last couple of years, is they really want to do more than predictive maintenance. So in this case, the client was the asset owner, and they wanted this predictive maintenance service, and the vendor says, well, we need to access this server on your ICS to get the data. You say, well, no, we don't want to let you into our system. We'll send you the data through one of these Oneway devices. Vendor repeats, no, we have to get the data. We send the data. This goes back and forth, back and forth. Literally, in the example I'm thinking of, it was over 10 calls and over 1 year before they finally agreed that we could send them the data. And it just seemed really strange. But then you look at the shoe on the other foot. So in this case, the vendor was a client. The vendor who wanted to provide this predictive maintenance service was the client. And they said, hey, we want to offer this service, but we know we're going to be asked the security question. So how do we have a great answer when they say, will our ICS or our underlying process be at risk by getting this predictive maintenance service? No problem. We can have a variety of tiered options, and the most secure option for your most security-conscious clients would be one of these Oneway devices. We can guarantee them that we can provide the service, and we will not be able to get on their network. So we will not be the source of an attack. And then you get to the truth. The vendors say, well, we have visions for the future where we want to do a lot more than just predictive maintenance, where we actually want to be able to access the ICS. So they don't want to put in this capability that restricts them from offering future services. And my guess, I heard rumblings in the organizations, but when we were representing the asset owner, the same thing was true. The vendor wanted to provide additional services. And so I think what we're going to find, and actually it's happening today, is vendors will want to provide a variety of services much beyond predictive maintenance, including things like remote operations, remote engineers, in some cases running almost everything remotely. And there are going to be cases, and I think the industry is underestimating the number of them, but there are going to be many cases where it makes financial sense for the owner-operator to take advantage of those services, either because they can do it with acceptable risk or they're not doing a good job on their own. So we need to come up with a way of dealing with this. And my simple solution is 4 steps. The first step is probably the hardest and the most important. There needs to be a definition. The vendor has to define, in this case, let's say the cloud service provider needs to specifically define the set of services they are willing to offer remotely from the cloud to the owner-operator. And this has to be a very granular definition. The owner-operator needs to understand what would be the impact if that cloud service provider was compromised. So if he was able to do all the things that I want to allow him to do, what would be the impact to my system? And they need to be able to live with that. Now, this does not mean that you don't look at the security of your service provider. He should be following best practices. He should be getting the certifications. And in fact, it's a little bit scary because we're seeing a number of vendors in this industry not learn the lessons of what's already been done. They're basically creating these services and trying to figure out what is the appropriate way to secure them, rather than taking what has already been developed and proven. But even with a vendor providing good cloud services, you have to assume that they're going to be compromised, and then what are you going to allow them to do to your system? So, for example, you could allow them to operate but not change a logic or a program. You could allow them to operate part of your plant. You could allow them to write to certain function code or write to certain registers, so turn certain things on and off or change certain settings but not others. Again, you're getting down to that level of granularity. I put request diagnostics on there just almost as a counterexample. This would be something that could be pushed out, but if you are going to allow the cloud service provider access into your system, then the value of deploying a separate unidirectional gateway or one-way system or data diode, whatever you want to call it, is much less. So as soon as you're allowing the cloud service provider access into your system, you might as well allow whatever you're going to permit based on this agreement. Now, I want to take just a slight detour from my 4 steps to talk about, I think, a really exciting field. And I think the next talk on the cyber PHA is really applicable to this. You know, if we think that we have agreed with our cloud service provider that they can do these things remotely into our system, if a bad guy is able to do these things, they will be able to have some level of impact. Today, one thing we could do to allow remote services is relook at, well, is there some safety control? Is there some way we can change our control logic so if the bad guy gets into the cloud and if he runs these commands, the consequences are lower? So we can actually be relooking at our safety and our protection philosophies to reduce risk for remote operations. I mean, this could be deploying non-cyber safety mechanisms to prevent bad things from happening. It could be process-based. For example, maybe you'll allow them to run this critical command, but there's a physical switch in your plant that you have to flip before that command will be actually actionable. So I think this is a real good area where if you're going to want someone to do remote services, you're going to have to go back and look at your safety philosophy. And I would point you to Ralph Langner's presentation at last year's S4, where he shows a real good example of modifying safety, the way we look at safety for a nuclear feed water system. So you may be able to extend what you think is possible with remote services or cloud services if you adjust that. Okay, so step 1, define cloud service provider, asset owner, specifically what you're going to allow them to do. Number 2 then is to find a way to enforce that. So you're going to need a security perimeter device that restricts them to these pre-approved items. Now, the good news, I'm sure a lot of you saw this if you walked around the Cabana sessions yesterday, and we have even more vendors as attendees. Anomaly detection gateway devices with deep packet inspection for ICS is a very quick growing, very competitive field with lots of options out there. So having something like this should not be difficult. It would require the cloud service provider to partner with one of these vendors and say, okay, here's what we want. Here's, let's say, the menu that we want them to be able to choose from, and when they choose this menu item, we need to be able to enforce it in your device. This also might be a great area for certification testing, because once you've defined what's allowed through, what should be allowed through, put a device in place to enforce that, then steps 3 and 4 are really just making sure it works. So step 3 would be making sure the perimeter security device works properly, and hopefully this would not be something that each asset owner would have to do. Ideally, this would be something that the vendor would be able to say, hey, we've done this testing. Here you can look at the test reports. The system actually works. And most asset owners might be willing to accept that. Of course, you can test it if you have your own doubts. And then number 4 is a little bit different. And number 4 is a little bit like fuzzing. The idea is you've agreed to allow this communication through your security perimeter from, let's say, a potentially compromised site out on the internet or in the cloud somewhere. If that allowed traffic is allowed to reach a PLC or an engineering workstation or whatever you choose, will that cause a negative action, let's say an unexpected action on that server? Of course, if you allow them to send a command through, that command is going to be activated, but this is really similar to fuzz testing. And the nice thing about this is if we've defined the hole in our security perimeter tightly, then this testing doesn't have the code coverage problem that fuzz testing has. We should be able to actually test the entire amount of what is allowed through the security perimeter and validate that it, for example, doesn't cause the end device to crash. So this is my 4-step simple solution. And the first step, again, is the most important. The vendors needs to say, these are the remote services we offer. The asset owner needs to say, yes, I will accept these services, and they're well defined. You put a security perimeter device in place that restricts the cloud service provider to those services, and the asset owner understands the impact if that cloud service provider is compromised and is willing to accept it. And then steps 3 and 4 verify that the thing actually works and those services will not damage your system to an unacceptable level. Now, my fear is that the ICS community, we have a bad history of opening Pandora's box without understanding the implications of it. If you think back to the 90s when we started connecting corporate networks to ICS, we connected everything up, and then later on we decided we needed to start worrying about how to secure it. We bring Windows in, and then we start to worry about how to secure it. I mean, we're seeing this with virtualization and all sorts of technologies. The key thing for us here is that we don't, for example, start allowing a cloud service provider unrestricted access to our ICS at the beginning, because it's very difficult to pull that back at the end. This is something that we need to get in front of, and I'm hoping that this will give you some ideas with your projects on how to take advantage of these great new services that are being offered at a risk level that's acceptable to you. Thank you very much.